Well, these comments barely scratch the surface of the formation and implementation of policy during the unipolar moment, but I think they're characteristic. One significant element is the continuity of planning and interpretation since World War II, when the United States shouldered the responsibility that was eloquently described by Winston Churchill, the responsibility to protect the interests of the satisfied nations whose power places us above the rest, the rich men dwelling in peace within their habitations, to whom the government of the world must be entrusted, now under Washington's guiding hand. And that remains the operative meaning of the fashionable phrase, responsibility to protect. Thanks.
We will field some questions. We'll field some questions, as you said, yeah. Okay. Let me say that Professor Chomsky, we have time for people from the audience to pose some questions for him. There are, I see a couple of microphones here, and given the unsteady acoustics in this room, it would be a good idea for anyone who wants to pose a question to just come up to one of these two microphones in the center aisle. So I invite anyone who wants to ask a question to just come up, and we will hear you. Go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. My question is about Afghanistan. We hear a lot in the corporate media about why we're in Afghanistan and why we need to expand the number of troops there, how that might hasten the end of the war somehow, and we're in there to fight Al-Qaeda because they're a threat to us, and so forth. Why do you think that the United States is in Afghanistan? What do you think the real mission is?
We can go back to the original invasion. You heard a version of the story from Obama a couple of nights ago, but there's also reality, not just invention. And it's pretty easy to check. You know, it's not obscure. I mean, you're not going to find it in the front pages, but a little work and you'll dig it out. So it was supposedly a reaction to 9/11. We had to defend ourselves from terror. Well, let's imagine that protection of the population from terror was a high priority of the government. It's almost unimaginable, but suppose it were true. Well, they had some very straightforward ways to proceed. I'm sure their specialists in the State Department could have informed them that the jihadi movement was highly critical of Osama bin Laden. They bitterly condemned 9/11. I mean, there were fatwas coming out from the most radical clerics in Al-Azhar University, the most important university, denouncing Osama bin Laden and so on. So there was a perfect opportunity to split the jihadi movement, isolate Osama bin Laden, and significantly reduce the threat of terror. Instead, they chose to do the opposite, to act in a way which united the jihadi movement, and then invading Iraq, of course, did so even more. As one of innumerable examples that protecting the population is not a high priority of this government or governments in general. So that would have been one reaction. Now, of course, there was a serious crime, not as serious as 9/11, 1973, but still very serious. So what do you do when there's a crime? Well, you try to identify the perpetrators, capture them. If it's an international issue, use international forces, no problem in this case, and bring them to trial and have a fair trial. Well, they couldn't do that. They didn't try to do that, and there's a good reason, which was explained later on. 8 months after 9/11, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, had interviews with the Washington Post in which he told them that we really don't know who was responsible. He says, we believe that the plot was hatched in Afghanistan but implemented in the United Arab Emirates and Germany. Well, if they only could believe it in April, they didn't know it the preceding October, which is why they did not respond. Presumably that's the reason why they didn't respond to the Taliban when they, who had made tentative offers to extradite Osama bin Laden, but wanted to see some evidence. That's what you do when you ask for extradition. And of course this was contemptuously rejected. So we went ahead and bombed. That's a major war crime. First of all, there was no international authorization of any kind, totally violated international law, but it was a moral war crime in a deeper sense. You have to go back to that time. At that time, there were an estimated 5 million Afghans. They were right at the edge of starvation, and it was predicted that the aid agencies, which all had to flee, warned repeatedly and loudly that if the U.S. bombed, it would put at risk another 2.5 million people. Well, fortunately the worst didn't happen, but that's not the way you estimate the moral character of an action. You estimate it on the basis of likely consequences. So they were willing to take a risk of killing another 2.5 million Afghans in order to achieve their ends. Well, what were the ends? Not to end terror, plainly. Actually, I think the ends were pretty well described by some of the leading anti-Taliban Afghans, including the U.S. favorite, Abdul Haq, who was later killed. They strongly, strenuously objected to the bombing. They said the bombing is just killing innocent civilians. It's undermining our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, which they thought pretty reasonably could succeed. And you're only doing it because you want to show your muscle and intimidate the world. And of course, Afghanistan has, unfortunately for Afghans, a strategic location right on the periphery of the major oil-producing regions in the Middle East and Central Asia and, of course, South Asia. And that goes way back in history, and they've suffered for it. So we don't have documents yet, internal documents. Maybe we'll get them someday. But it looks as if those were the reasons. Well, why is it continuing? Well, we don't have documents from today either. Incidentally, you heard the other night that the world supported us in the bombing. Well, that depends very much on how you define the world. So, for example, if the world includes the people of the world, we know the answer. You have to do a little work to find the answer, but it's not really difficult on these internet days, and there are books, mine, others, that talk about it. But right after the bombing was announced, but before it started, there was an international Gallup poll all over the world, which asked people whether they were in favor of bombing. Now, the question was asked on the assumption that it would be selective. It would go after the perpetrators, and those civilians would be attacked, which of course never happened. And on that assumption, there was very little support. Only 2 countries had even majority support. One was India, the other was Israel. But India and Israel, I don't think were even thinking about Afghanistan. India was thinking about Kashmir, and Israel was thinking about the Palestinians. So yeah, you want to go bomb people, great. That's a bomb Pakistan, But even in Europe, the numbers were like in the 20 to 30 percentile. But most interesting were the Latin American answers. Latin America had a little bit of experience with U.S. intervention. In Latin America, the figures support range from 2% in Mexico, that is the half of Mexico that we didn't conquer, 2% support there. It went up to, I think, 11% in Colombia, and even in Panama, which is practically a U.S. colony, it was like 16% or something. Well, that was the popular support for the bombing on the assumption that it wouldn't hit civilians, which of course it did. The media cooperated by not reporting it. An international Gallup poll on an issue like that is kind of important, so therefore it's better suppressed. Why are we staying? As I said, we don't have internal documents, but I suspect it's partly the same reasons, the strategic location and so on and so forth. There's probably another factor. It's what Dan Ellsberg called the, what did he call it, the stalemate machine, I think, when he was writing about U.S. policies in Vietnam through the 60s. He said kind of accurately, I think the documents support it, that the idea was to just keep it going so you don't lose the next election. If you wanted to win the war, in my opinion, the U.S. actually did win the war in Vietnam, but that's another story. But if you wanted to reach the maximum goals, you would have had to move up to nuclear warfare or something like that. And to reach the maximal goals here, it's not even clear how you would do that. But you don't want to, be attacked as soft, wimpish, not courageous like Theodore Roosevelt and those good guys that we honor. So it's probably that the stalemate machine is probably a factor. I mean, the plans that were announced the other day make absolutely no sense on any grounds. But we're not going to suffer from it except paying. The Afghans will suffer as usual, and the Pakistanis, who may be in real trouble if this continues.
We're going to get. Do you want to sit?
No,
okay.
That's okay.
The next question.
What about China doing deals in Africa? Resources, inking deals, pardon the pun, in the Middle East, unipolar version of the official story. Are you turning are they the new Aryans? Are you turning your attention to them these days?
No, I'm turning my attention to them, but they're pursuing, you can like them or hate them, whatever you like, but on these issues they're pursuing peaceful means. Like they're not overthrowing governments. They don't have 800 military bases around the world. They don't outspend the rest of the world combined in, military and intelligence expenditures. They're not pursuing the militarization of space. In fact, they're leading the way in global opposition to it. They're not occupying two countries as we are. So, they're pursuing their own interests, trying to gain control over resources. A lot of it's very ugly. So, like supporting the Burmese military, which they do by getting oil from Burma, as incidentally does the United States under Chevron has contracts there, and even more so Britain and France. That's ugly, but it's a long way from military intervention. In fact, they have a lot of rotten things inside, but outside the borders, there's nothing much to complain about.
Okay, next.
I want to thank you for your lecture. I have a broader question. Edward Said used to quote a poet, a Caribbean poet, and he used to say there's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. We live in a time of unipolar dominance. Do you think U.S. hegemony is ever going to decrease and not be replaced by another polarizing system?
Do you think that our unipolar hegemony will eventually be replaced by some multipolar system at some point, or is it inevitable?
Well, the world is, for the last several decades, economically at least, on the economic dimension, the world's becoming considerably more diverse. So, in 1950, after the war, the United States had literally half the world's wealth. By 1970, it was down to 25%, and now it's maybe 20%. And centers of economic power have been developing. Like Europe is roughly comparable to the United States, in some respects richer. Northeast Asia, the tigers, and now China and India to an extent, are becoming another center of world power. I mean, they're nowhere near the power of the United States. So, actually, I know a historian who teaches in a state college who asks her students every year, freshmen, what they think are the richest countries in the world. And their answers are India and China. Okay, you read the newspapers, you might think those are the richest countries in the world. If you look up the Human Development Index, you find that India, I think, is around 130th or something, and China's around maybe 90th, and it would probably be lower if it wasn't so totalitarian and you could actually find out what's going on inside. But yeah, they're growing powers in a symbiotic relationship with us. They're not. In one dimension, the world remains completely unipolar, the military dimension. I mean, there's no other power that's even in shouting distance or even trying. And there are now what are called the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Okay, that's a unit. The world is becoming more diverse. And the most striking case, I think I didn't talk about much, is Latin America. I mean, Latin America has been, the backyard. When the Nixon administration was getting ready to overthrow Allende, the National Security Council pointed out that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the world? This is taken for granted. We've got to control Latin America. Well, that's declining. The South America, for the first time in 500 years, is moving towards some kind of integration and towards facing its horrific internal problems. I mean, virtually every Latin American country is kind of like Honduras, where we just praised the democratic election. There's a tiny, rich elite, mostly white or Europeanized, and they're just in a sea of misery, and the rich have no responsibility for the country. It's one of the main reasons why Latin America doesn't develop, and East Asia did. But it's changing. I mean, there are moves towards integration. There are moves towards facing some of these problems in different ways in different countries. The U.S. is having a hard time with it. I mean, in 1964, Kennedy could just organize a military coup to overthrow the social democratic government in Brazil. Well, Goulart's, the president's policies were not very different from Lula today, but now they can't do that. In fact, Lula is sort of the fair-haired boy because he's presented as being less extreme than the bad guys. It's mostly presentation. So, for example, like if Chavez praises Ahmadinejad, horrors. When Lula praises Ahmadinejad even more, silence. They couldn't keep it completely silent when Ahmadinejad visited Brazil a couple of weeks ago, so then there was some tapping on the wrist. But that difference is a striking one. And what it reflects is the fact that the major weapons for controlling Latin America have very much declined in efficacy. One is economic strangulation, and that kind of declines as the world becomes more diverse. And the other is just plain military power. So the U.S. has been kicked out of all of its bases in South America. The last one was a couple of months ago in Ecuador. But the U.S. is reacting, as you'd expect. So the U.S. now has 7 new bases in Colombia, and Obama has quietly added 2 more, 2 naval bases in Panama. The 4th Fleet, which was disbanded in 1950, covers that region, has been reconstructed. Training of Latin American military officers is going way up. Their mission is to combat radical populism, and everybody in Latin America understands what that means. So there are efforts to rebuild the weapons, but it's not as easy as before. So yeah, that's a shift in world power, and a significant one. There are also South-South relations developing. Just a couple of days ago, there was a trade agreement with Brazil, India, China, and a couple other powers, I forget, but kind of like a South trade agreement. Okay, those are all new things, and they do diffuse world power. So it might lead to a more multipolar world, which I think would be a very good thing.
That are great against this, a movement for change. How? I mean, we saw what happened to Martin Luther King. We saw what happened to, Malcolm X, and even Fred Hampton. He was very articulate. He started to, the FBI went right in and had to get. Is it possible to create some kind of movement or a political party? Should we be supporting the Greens? Is there any hope that the Democrats can be brought further left? Do we need to create a new left in the United States, a highly organized left like it did exist in the 1960s up until very recently? What mechanism can we do to translate your brilliant ideas into action? Or you name the problems so well. How can, when we leave here tonight, what can we begin to do?
The same way it's always. I mean, I think we know the answers. It involves organizing, which is hard work. You know, you have to keep at it. It doesn't happen in one day. You've got to be dedicated to it. I'd like to say, take the civil rights movement, which you mentioned. Yes, Martin Luther King was killed, but you know, he would have been the first to say that he did not create the civil rights movement. He was riding on a wave of lots of that action, which goes way back. I mean, we're kind of not allowed to say this, but a lot of it was the Communist Party. But so, you know, quiet, don't say it. But there was, you know, there's decades, in fact, of activism, which, and even in the 60s, the movement was led by people whose names we don't even know, like every popular movement, like the SNCC workers, who were riding freedom buses and sitting in at lunch counters. And that created a substantial support, which gained, the Kennedy administration tried to block it, but, you know, finally Johnson kind of, you know, authorized it. It had support from the North, crucially, as long as it was attacking racist sheriffs in Alabama. If you take a look at the reactions in the North at the same time, it was quite different. I can talk about that if you like. But it followed the imperial ideology, you know, their crimes, not ours. But it was significant, and Martin Luther King was a very important person. Remember when he was assassinated. He was assassinated when he was organizing a poor people's movement. He was killed in support of a sanitation workers' strike. Okay, that was too much. You know, he stopped being a hero when he wasn't just attacking racist sheriffs in Alabama, but was talking about organizing people, of course, opposing the war in Vietnam. Then his reputation kind of declined among important people like us, you know, the people who write books and articles. But it was a real popular movement, a major one, made many successes, and there was a lot more. I mean, this is a very different country from what it was in the 60s. I mentioned just one thing. You couldn't write that diplomatic history that I quoted from 1969, and nobody could write that today, even in, you know, anywhere in the country. Okay, that's a change in consciousness, but it's also a change in it changed behavior, attitudes, understanding. I mean, probably the most important movement that grew out of the 60s in terms of its effect on the country was the women's movement. Well, yeah, it didn't start in the 60s. Germs were there, but it really picked up in the 70s and later. The solidarity movements, which are very important. I mean, that's the first time in the history of imperialism. There's no other country that I know of which ever had anything like the American solidarity movements. Like, people in France didn't go live in a Vietnamese village or Algerian village to help people and protect them from the white predators. But that happened in the United States in the 80s in a very substantial level, mostly kind of Main Street. You know, it's coming from Midwest, Southwest, evangelical movements. And it's still there. You know, there are solidarity workers all over the place, very brave. And the anti-nuclear movement took off in the 1980s, and it's kind of interesting to see the way elites respond. Read today's Financial Times, British papers. There's the new European Union foreign minister, Lady Ashton, was being grilled on her past, and one of the charges against her was, and she had to kind of apologize for this, was that she was a supporter of CND, Committee on Nuclear Disarmament, which was part of a mass popular movement, you know, reached about 80% in the United States against nuclear weapons. So that's a charge against her in elite circles. But there's a lot of, you know, public is there. So we're in a much better position, easy to go on, but we're in a much better position now than people were in the 60s to carry all this forward. You know, we've got their legacy to build on. And the methods are the old ones. You know, nobody's got a magic key. I think it's absurd to claim that we can't do it. I mean, just take a look at some of the South American countries, like the poorest country in South America, okay, Bolivia. I mean, that's had democratic elections of the kind we can't even dream of. So like in 2005, the majority of the population, the most repressed people in the hemisphere, the indigenous population, actually entered the political arena, elected someone from their own ranks, who were peasant, on real issues, which everybody knew, not hope and change, but the real issues, control of resources, justice, cultural rights, complex society. And election day was not of any particular importance. It was just one day in a constant, ongoing struggle. And that's one of the reasons why the United States why the coverage of Bolivia, is so harsh and critical. I mean, they had real democratic achievements. That's scary. Well, it's ridiculous to claim that we can't do what Bolivian peasants can. Of course we can. I mean, it's not going to happen by itself. Never has.
Okay, thank you. Next question here.
I've been criticized for calling American imperialist and had trouble why America's imperialist when it differs in some ways from classical European imperialism, or even the way we were in the Soviet era. So I was hoping you could articulate an argument exactly how the U.S. is imperialist.
How does it?
Why is it that? What is the argument for why the United States is full of imperialism?
Washington, who called it an infant empire. I mean, conquest of the national territory is imperialism. They didn't doubt it in the 19th century. There is what some historians of imperialism call a saltwater fallacy, meaning you call it imperialism only if it crosses salt water. So like if the Mississippi were like the Irish Sea, say you'd call it imperialism. But that doesn't make sense. If you ask the victims, of course it was imperialism, just as George Washington said. Yeah, it's different from other countries, and Germany was different from England, and so on and so forth. And there are some real innovations if you look at the history. I don't have time to talk about it. There's a terrific book that just came out, which is very illuminating about this. It's by Alfred McCoy, who's a historian at Wisconsin, who's a Philippine specialist. He just came out with a very interesting study, which has a lot of current implications on how the United States, it's the first real study on what the United States did in the Philippines after conquering it. I mean, they invaded, conquered it, Christianized them, all the usual stuff, killed a couple 100,000 people, but then they had to do something. And that part hasn't yet been studied, but he went through a ton of archival records, and what was done was quite interesting. The U.S. used the highest available current technology, it was then telegraph, radio, that sort of thing, to construct a surveillance society of a kind that never existed until the present. They tried to establish total control over individuals. They also worked out techniques to break up nationalist groups by infiltrating, sowing rumors, all sorts of things. Of course, they had to co-opt a Filipino elite, but that's always easy. They established you have to have a mailed fist, so there was the Philippine constabulary, if things got out of control. And that lasts until today. I mean, the Philippines are still under that system. It's one of the reasons they are the unique part of the region that didn't undergo the rise of the tigers. Furthermore, there was a blowback. Woodrow Wilson imposed something similar, using similar techniques during and after the First World War, and it's coming now. So, surveillance societies, let's say Britain is more advanced than the U.S. in this respect. But the most striking example, in fact, is Israel and the occupied territories. It's exactly what